Welcome to Boring History for Sleep, where the candles are always flickering low, the wind is always whispering through ancient stone halls, and history is told gently, like a bedtime story meant to ease you into a long, restful night. Tonight, we wander far from battlefields and courts of kings. Instead, we step quietly into a world of prayer, silence, and sore knees, the monastery. For many, the word might conjure a peaceful image, hooded figures moving slowly through cloisters, whispering Latin prayers, tending gardens under cloudy skies. But beneath the tranquil image was a life of discipline, control, and surprising discomfort. Tonight, we'll explore the quieter, colder corners of the Middle Ages, the whispered rules, the aching hours, the unwritten tensions. We begin. But in the dark corridor of change, when a boy, just barely old enough to work the fields, took his first steps toward becoming a monk, let your thoughts settle. Let the outside world soften and drift away, and imagine yourself barefoot and shivering at the gates of the monastery. It often began in silence. A boy, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, would be brought to the monastery gates, usually by family. Sometimes he arrived with hope. Other times he arrived with resignation. Either way, the heavy wooden doors opened not into comfort, but into a world where the rules of life, speech, food, movement would never again be his to decide. Imagine yourself there. The sun is low. The wind smells faintly of iron and sheep. Your hands are calloused from work, but trembling now as the porter opens the gate. You step inside, and the world behind you, your mother's voice, your brother's laughter slips away with the closing of the door. You are now a novice. The initiation was not immediate, but the breaking in began early. Clothes were among the first things taken. The novice would strip off his worldly garb, often little more than a tunic, and belt-hand receive instead a coarse wool robe, often unwashed and stiff from years of wear. It itched terribly, especially in winter, when dry skin cracked under the weight of cold fabric. Underwear, a luxury, shoes, worn sparingly. Silence was next. Monasteries were ruled by a strict, regular the rule, usually that of Saint Benedict, and silence was among its most enduring demands. For the young, unaccustomed to such stillness, the absence of speech could feel louder than any crowd. Questions were to be asked only in designated places, at designated times. Laughter frowned upon, whispering forbidden. And then there was the sleep, or rather the lack of it. Novices learned quickly that the rhythm of monastic life was not guided by the sun, but by bells that tolled deep in the night, summoning even the youngest to matins, the first of many daily prayers. This might begin at 2 or 3 in the morning. The stone floor beneath your feet was cold. The candlelight flickered against damp walls. Your breath made small clouds in the dark, and you knelt. Long prayers were said in Latin. You likely didn't understand most of the words at first, but you would learn them, if only because the rhythm of the prayers would become the rhythm of your entire life. There was discipline, to quiet, but firm. A novice who yawned too freely, who failed to bow low enough, who let his thoughts wander too visibly during prayers, might be punished, not cruelly, always, but clearly, with fewer rations, with extra chores, with exclusion from communal meals, which were themselves silent and sparse. One bowl, one spoon, often boiled legumes, cold bread, and water. And yes, there was reading and learning, for those permitted it. But for many, the early years were consumed by labor, carrying water, chopping wood, sweeping cloisters, learning obedience, not through threats, but through quiet, relentless repetition. Monks believed that the body must be humbled to lift the soul, and so the novice learned to bow, to kneel, to wait, to carry heavy buckets without complaint, to scrub floors that never seemed clean, to ring bells at times when sleep felt like a dream just beyond reach. The transition was not short. It could last years. Some boys ran away, though the penalties were severe. Some begged to return home. A few were sent away if deemed unfit for obedience or chastity, but many stayed, and over time their backs bent into the rhythm of this new life. The silence became less heavy, the itching robe less irritating. Even the midnight bells became expected. Because this was not punishment, not in the minds of the monks. This was purification, an unshaping of the self, a smoothing of the will, a letting go of the outside world to make room for something eternal. And so the boy became a novice, and the novice became a monk, and the monk became one small thread in the vast, quiet fabric of monastic life, a life where the days blurred, where time was marked only by bells, and where the self slowly vanished into ritual. In the next segment, we'll follow this rhythm more closely. Through the daily routines that shaped monastic existence, from dawn to dusk and back again, the monastery was a world ruled by bells. They tolled not in alarm or celebration, but in routine, in gentle tyranny. To live as a monk was to surrender your personal sense of time to the monastery's internal clock, one wound not by the sun or the seasons, but by centuries of ritual. Imagine yourself again. You wake in the darkness, not because you are rested, but because the bell has called you. It is time for matins the night office. You rise from your straw-filled mattress in the dormitory. Around you, other shapes rustle in the dark, robes brushing quietly against wooden floors. No one speaks. No one needs to. You light your taper or follow another's flickering flame. Your breath fogs faintly in the winter air. The only sound is the gentle creak of footfalls, and somewhere ahead, the drone of the chant has already begun. Inside the cold chapel, the walls echo with voices, not loud, never loud, but persistent. Latin words, learned through repetition, not choice. You kneel, you stand, you sit, you kneel again, and then, just when you feel sleep settling behind your eyes, matins ends, a brief pause, and then lauds begins. This is the rhythm. 7 or sometimes 8 canonical hours of prayer each day. Matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. These names marked the hours, but also the shape of your life. They cut the day into sacred slices, each one structured, expected, and unchanging, and between them you did not rest, you worked. After the morning prayers, there might be a brief return to the dormitory, but rarely to sleep. Tasks awaited many, dictated by the rule of Saint Benedict, which emphasized both ora et laboro prayer and work. In the vegetable garden, frost might still cling to the leaves. You would hoe and dig, trim and gather. Potatoes, beans, onions, nothing extravagant, but essential. Sometimes you would be assigned to the dairy, milking cows in silence, or to the scriptorium, where copying a single page could take an entire day, and always the bell. A reminder that the work was never truly your own, that even your labor belonged to the rule. Breakfast, not quite. There was no meal first thing in the morning, only terced the 3rd hour. Then a bowl of thin porridge, or a chunk of bread with a small cup of ale. Not strong ale, but a weak, fermented drink, safer than most water. Meals were taken in silence, beneath the eyes of a painted Christ and the listening ears of a reader. Because yes, even during meals, a monk would read aloud, usually hagiographies or spiritual commentaries. Your ears were not your own either, and so you chewed slowly, in silence, to the sound of someone else's voice describing saints who had suffered more than you. Sometimes the food was beans. Often it was beans, boiled, salted, simple, filling, and frequently repeated. There was little variation in diet, especially for the lower-ranking monks. Festive days brought small luxuries: cheese, fish, occasionally an egg butt. Most days blurred together in a haze of muted flavors. The monotony was the point. It stripped away distraction. It denied pleasure. It made the sacred stand out more starkly when it came. After the midday prayers, sext, and none, there might be rest. A short nap was sometimes permitted, especially in summer, but often there was more labor, or scripture study, or copying texts. The scriptorium was quiet, save for the scratching of quills. Ink was precious, mistakes costly. You dipped and wrote, and blew gently to dry each line. Your mind wandered, but your hand must not. By late afternoon, the sun hung low. The shadows in the cloisters stretched long. The walls felt cooler again as the heat of the day faded. Vespers came with candlelight, a soft glow against stone. You stood in a line of identical robes, your face one of many, as the chant carried the room like smoke. Then a final meal, another silent bowl, a sliver of cheese, perhaps, and Compline, the night prayer. You knelt once more. You made the sign of the cross. You sang the Salve Regina, the closing hymn, and then the great silence began. From Compline until Lauds the next morning, no speech was permitted, not even a whisper, not even a cough, if it could be helped. You returned to your narrow bed. Your body ached in small, subtle ways. Your knees from kneeling, your back from bending, your stomach not quite full. The wind rattled the shutters. The stone held the day's chill. And still you gave thanks, because discomfort was a gift, boredom a blessing, repetition a path to God. It did not matter how you felt. The goal was not personal comfort or emotional fulfillment. It was obedience, devotion, the humbling of the self through rhythm. And so you slept until the bell rang again, and you rose again. The wind outside the monastery walls may howl against the stone, but inside one candle flickers, and at its side sits Bede. Imagine him there, not as a saintly statue in a chapel alcove, but as a quiet, aging monk, hunched over parchment. His eyes are dimming, his hands stiffening, but his mind, it is vast. Bede, known later as the Venerable Bede, was not a man of battlefields or crowns. He did not lead armies. He never journeyed far from home, and yet his words would shape the very identity of a people. Born around the year 673, Bede entered the monastery at Monkwyrmouth as a child, perhaps around the age of 7, a boy offered to the church. Not uncommon in those days, not rare. He grew up among sandstone cloisters and Latin chants. He watched the seasons shift through narrow windows. He copied letters before he understood them, and only later came to understand what they could do. His life, by all accounts, was steady, predictable. He remained at Monkwyrmouth and Jarrow to twin monasteries in what is now Northumbria, in the north of England. He never left Britain, but his vision reached further than most kings could ever ride. Bede loved learning, but more than that, he revered order. He believed history had meaning, that the unfolding of events was not random, but purposeful, that God moved through time as surely as he did through prayer. And so Bede wrote. He wrote about astronomy, the movement of stars. He wrote about chronology, how to calculate Easter. He wrote biblical commentaries, allegories, riddles, poems. But perhaps his greatest legacy was his Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, the ecclesiastical history of the English people. It is a long, careful work, not flashy, not fiery, but rich in detail and grounded in the rhythms of the church. Through Bede's pen, we first hear of Cadman the cowherd, who became the first recorded English poet. We glimpse the conversion of kings, the debates of bishops, the slow Christianization of a once pagan land. Bede did not just write what he saw. He gathered what others had written. He sifted through letters, annals, oral accounts, piecing together a tapestry of English identity at a time when England was not yet one nation. He helped name the island, and more quietly, Bede gave us time. You see, Bede was among the first to use the dating system Anno Domini in the year of our Lord, a choice that shaped how Europe, and eventually the world, would measure its past. Time, for Bede, was sacred. It ticked not in minutes and hours, but in divine patterns. Christ came once, and all things before and after must align with that point. As he aged, Bede's body failed, but his mind did not. In his final days, he composed a translation of the Gospel of John into Old English. A student wrote at his side. And when the candle flickered low, and Bede knew his time was near, he still dictated, lines pausing only to pray or to cough. He died in the year 735. The monks buried him, not in gold, not in grandeur, but with the quiet respect owed to one who had given his life to the rhythm of the monastery. And over centuries, his reputation grew. The church called him Venerable. His scholarship earned him the title Father of English History. His memory lingered, gentle, unobtrusive, but steady, like the steady echo of chant in stone corridors, like the soft scrape of quill on vellum. Bede reminds us that greatness can grow from silence, that influence need not come from power, that a quiet life faithfully lived can ripple through centuries. And now, as you rest in the warmth of your own bed, with blankets far softer than straw, and the silence chosen, not enforced, you might hear, faintly, the turning of pages, and imagine Bede still reading, still writing, still watching time unfold, one careful line at a time. Not the hushed silence of a room at work, but the silence of absence. Shelves bare, scrolls missing, bindings torn, manuscripts gone. Where did they go? The answer is neither quick nor simple. It lies in storms of history of war, of decay, of reform and neglect. But let us begin at the height of preservation. In the early medieval period, monasteries were often the only places where texts survived. Latin works from Rome, Greek works from Byzantium, local saints, lives, lists of kings, medical treatises, psalters, sermons. A monk's labor was not merely devotional, it was preservational. To copy a text was to give it another life, and yet so few of these manuscripts remain. Estimates vary, but some scholars suggest that more than 90% of texts known to have existed in the early Middle Ages are lost. 90%. that is not just a tragedy of literature, is a reshaping of memory itself. So where did they go? Sometimes they simply faded. Decay is patient and thorough. Even in the cool, dry air of a scriptorium, parchment can rot, ink can fade, bindings can crumble. Mice, beetles, and mold all found ways in. And in some cases, books were repurposed, scraped clean to be written on again. Parchment was expensive, and memories were overwritten. Then there were fires, a candle knocked too close, a lightning strike, a raider's torch, wooden buildings with thatched roofs caught easily. And when the flames rose, libraries perished alongside dormitories and chapels. The Viking raids of the 9th century alone destroyed countless monastic holdings. Lindisfarne, Iona, Jarrow, the invaders came for silver, but books burned in their wake. Then came reform, the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. In the 1530s, may be one of the greatest cultural losses in English history. Across England, abbeys and priories were closed, monks expelled, buildings looted, libraries scattered. Some books were taken by collectors, a few hidden away by sympathetic scholars, but many were sold, used to bind other books, or simply discarded. Imagine centuries of accumulated knowledge piled onto carts and wheeled out, manuscripts tossed into piles, parchment used to polish armor, books sold for the value of their leather alone. It is said that whole cartloads of books were sent to market in London, sold by the armful, not for their words, but for their weight. Yet not all was lost. Some libraries were transferred. A few noble families preserved volumes in private collections. Some manuscripts made their way to Oxford and Cambridge, others to cathedrals or royal treasuries. Monks, too, sometimes took books with them hidden in sacks, beneath robes, passed hand to hand over generations. Still, what remains is a sliver, a glimpse, like finding a few leaves from an ancient tree, enough to know it once stood tall, but not enough to understand its full shape. Today, scholars painstakingly reconstruct catalogs. They study marginal notes, trace ownership histories, follow wormholes through parchment. A single page-damaged, incomplete can shed light on a forgotten custom, a regional dialect, a long-lost poem, and sometimes, just sometimes, a manuscript resurfaces in a barn, in a drawer, in the binding of a much later book, like a ghost whispering through vellum. The monasteries may be silent now, but the memory of their libraries lingers. So tonight, as you let your eyes grow heavy, picture those shelves again. The soft creak of wood, the scent of old ink, the stillness of a world where words were sacred and time moved at the pace of a quill across skin. And know that though the pages are few, the silence they left behind is still telling stories. Imagine yourself walking down a quiet cloister, stone beneath your feet, still damp from last night's rain, the morning chill clinging to the hem of your robe. You pass through an archway into the herbarium, a walled garden within the monastery, protected from wind and wandering goats. The air is cool, fragrant, and humming gently with bees. There are rows of carefully tended plants, lavender for calming the nerves, fennel for digestion, yarrow to slow bleeding, and comfrey, always comfrey for healing broken bones. This is no mere garden. It is a pharmacy, and the monks who tend it, they are the physicians of their age. Though they did not call themselves doctors in the way we might today, many monks were among the most educated medical minds of the medieval world. Their knowledge came from texts, some ancient, copied and recopied across centuries. Others, local, passed through whispered stories and regional practices. In the dim light of the scriptorium, monks pored over the works of Hippocrates and Galen, learning about the balance of humor's blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, they believed, came from imbalance. Too much heat, too little moisture, too much excitement, not enough sleep. Cures were gentle, if often ineffective by modern standards. They aimed not to battle the body, but to nudge it back into harmony. Imagine the tools of a medieval monastic healer: a mortar and pestle carved from stone, bowls of dried chamomile and sage, a spoon for measuring honey, linen strips for bandaging. The monastery infirmary was a quiet place, tucked away from the clamor of daily prayer and labor. Those who were ill were brought here: monks with fevers, villagers with coughs, travelers with infected wounds or aching joints. There were no scalpels, no syringes, no anesthesia, but there was care. Warm cloths placed on aching foreheads, poultices laid over swollen skin, broths laced with garlic or leek or thyme, and always the sound of prayer. For healing, in their view, was not merely physical, it was spiritual. To soothe the body was also to soothe the soul. But not all cures were so comforting. Monks experimented within the bounds of what they knew. They brewed concoctions that stung the tongue or clouded the mind. They induced vomiting with wine and herbs. They drained blood, believing it would cool the fever. They pressed leeches to skin knot often, but occasionally. They even used cow dung in savzerthi, potent and, surprisingly, mildly antiseptic. These remedies might seem strange, but they emerged from observation, repetition, and a kind of slow, steady wisdom. There was also a strong belief in the alignment of the stars. The zodiac governed not just fate, but the body itself. A monk might consult the moon before lancing a boil, or choose a day of Saturn for purging melancholy. To us, it may seem unscientific, but to them, it was part of the great harmony: the heavens above, the earth below, and the fragile body suspended in between. Some monasteries even kept what we might call medical records, ledgers of symptoms, cures, and outcomes. A monk who treated 50 fevers and saw 40 recover might note which herbs helped most, and pass that knowledge on. There were limits, of course. Plagues swept through despite their best efforts. Infectious diseases spread faster than they could be understood. Surgeries were rare and often fatal, and yet it is easy to forget that without monasteries, much of ancient medicine might have been lost entirely. From Salerno to Canterbury, from York to Monte Cassino, monks preserved, translated, and expanded upon the medical knowledge of the ancients. They stitched together learning with faith, wrapped wounds in linen and scripture, healed not with miracles, but with patient care. So as you rest now, drifting softly, picture the cool interior of the infirmary, the scent of thyme on the air, the whisper of a psalm beside your bed. And in that silence, remember the quiet devotion of those who tried to heal, not with power, but with herbs, hands, and hope. Imagine yourself once more in the cool halls of a monastery, the stones worn smooth beneath your feet, the candles flickering low in iron sconces. But this time, as you pass beneath the carved archways and cloistered gardens, you begin to notice something different. The silence still hangs thick, but it's no longer just the silence of prayer. It is the silence of command, a quiet power humming beneath every bowed head, carried not with swords, but with scrolls, with seals, and with the weight of divine authority. Welcome to the world of the abbot, not merely a man of God, but often a landholder, a judge, a diplomat, and in many ways, a prince in robes. By the height of the medieval period, some abbots ruled over vast territories. They presided over sprawling estates, villages, farmlands, and even entire regions. Their word was law, not just within the monastery walls, but beyond them, carried out by stewards, enforced by reeves, and respected by lords. Imagine a small English village in the 11th century, a cluster of thatched cottages, smoke curling from the roofs, oxen plodding in the fields, and on a hill above it all, the monastery, stone-built, fortified, its bell tower rising like a second sun over the countryside. The people below worked the land, but that land was not theirs. It belonged to the monastery, and by extension, to the abbot. They owed labor, rents in grain and eggs, and deference in disputes. The abbot, in turn, offered protection not from raiders or wolves, but from the crushing wheels of secular power. He might write to a noble, petition a bishop, or grant refuge within the monastery walls. He had a seal, a scribe, and the ear of both church and crown. It's easy to imagine monks as distant, humble figures, shuffling through gardens with bowed heads. But some abbots wore rings of gold, rode horses with embroidered saddles, and attended royal courts. At Cluny in France, the abbot was so powerful he answered only to the Pope himself, and even that, at times, was negotiable. The Abbey of St. Gall in modern Switzerland was both a religious center and a political one. Its abbot minted coins, raised armies, and arbitrated disputes between feuding nobles. At Fulda, Monte Cassino, Canterbury, abbots were often more than spiritual shepherds. They were landlords, legislators, and leaders of men. This power was not always welcomed. Tensions simmered between abbots and kings, between monks and bishops, between secular law and ecclesiastical privilege. Land disputes, tithes, inheritance, even battles quiet ones, fought with parchment and quill, shaped the delicate balance between monasteries and monarchs. And within the monastery itself, the abbot's word was nearly absolute. He could assign punishments, determine when silence must be kept, move monks to different duties, even expel them from the order. Some abbots were beloved, gentle stewards of their community. Others were feared, stern, inflexible, more concerned with wealth and influence than spiritual purity. It was a constant tension to be both servant and ruler, shepherd and master, humble and exalted. Even within the rule of Saint Benedict, the guiding text for many Western monasteries, there were careful words for the abbot. He must be sober, not haughty, compassionate, but firm, mindful that he would answer not only to men, but to God. And still, power crept in. Wealth flowed from land and tithes. Authority expanded with each legal charter. And by the late Middle Ages, some monasteries had become as politically potent as the nobles they were meant to renounce. But even this power could not last forever. With the rise of cities, the slow unraveling of feudal bonds, and the tides of reform and reformation, the abbot's might began to fade. Monasteries were dissolved, lands seized, libraries emptied, abbeys fell into ruin, stones taken for cottages, fields plowed for barley, and the abbot's voice, once ringing from high-backed chairs, fell silent. But for a time, within those walls of prayer and stone, monks ruled not just their own hearts, but the lives of thousands. They moved between the sacred and the political, between the page and the plow, holding the fragile balance of power in the folds of their habits. So now, as we prepare to leave this world behind, imagine once more the monastery at dusk. The bells have rung, the halls are quiet, and somewhere in the abbot's quarters, a candle still flickers. Outside, the villagers sleep, the fields rest, the sky fades from indigo to black, and in that stillness the monastery breathes, ancient, proud, and deeply human. So now, dear listener, as we leave behind the candlelit corridors and cold stone floors, let your mind drift gently from the world of the medieval monk. The journey has been long, from the shy, trembling steps of a novice, through the quiet grind of daily life, into the inner sanctums of scholarship, and out toward lost scrolls, strange salves, and the soft echo of power. But the rhythm of monastic life remains with us, like the toll of a distant bell across a misty field, steady, measured, unchanging, for all its hardships, the sore knees and empty stomachs, the bitter cold and sharper silences. Monastic life was also a world of devotion, of simplicity carved into routine, of order forged from chaos, and of purpose deep and slow burning, etched into the very stones of the cloister. Imagine, now, the stillness after compline. The final prayers of the day have faded into the rafters. The torches have been extinguished, and the halls echo only with the soft shuffle of sandaled feet. The world beyond those walls follow you into your dreams.